Welcome back, boxing fans. We had a great weekend of boxing. Obviously, some very unexpected results and some expected results. Tank Davis came through, did knock out Frank Martin the way I predicted, the way many people predicted. I don't think there was too many people really out there that actually felt Frank Martin was going to win, especially if you saw him during the weigh-in. He definitely did not look like he was going to be able to stand up to Tank Davis's power for 12 rounds. And inevitably, he succumbed and succumbed in a big way. Nice little uppercut in the inside and then a big left hand to finish the job. So great performance by Tank Davis. So this video today has nothing to do about hating Tank Davis. It's just going to squash some of those narratives that some people love to push out. Some people love to use certain fighters to build up other fighters. And this could go this way and it could go this way and it can go that way and it can go this way. So, this is not based on any particular situation. It's just we see this consistently. People are going to try to build up Tank Davis by criticizing Canelo Alvarez. Yet there's no comparison to Canelo Alvarez and Tank Davis. I mean, if you're being an honest boxing fan, that's obvious. That's clear cut. How old is Canelo Alvarez? 34, 33, 34. Tank Davis is going to be 30. Tank Davis is only a few years younger. Yet the things that Canelo Alvarez has achieved are things that Tank Davis is probably, inevitably, never going to achieve. Does that take away from Tank Davis's potential legacy? No, because he does not need to be the next Canelo Alvarez. He just needs to be the next Tank Davis, just like he doesn't need to be the next Floyd Mayweather, right? Unfortunately, some people love to shoehorn people into these situations because it fits the narrative they're trying to propel. The truth is, everybody that's really a boxing fan has been critical of the fact that Tank Davis has been kind of protected by his promotional company. And he's not the only fighter that gets protected by promotional companies. We see this consistently across the board. Probably the only promotional company that doesn't really protect their fighters is Matchroom Eddie Hearn, who literally puts his fighters in tough and gets them beat consistently. There's no other promoter in boxing that gets their world champions beat more than Eddie Hearn. So if people try to point fingers at him, it's a bad look because his fighters consistently get beat. Not because they're garbage, but because he's putting them in tricky, dangerous fights, right? With Tank Davis, sure, he's got some quality wins and some wins that are aging well. But overall, he's never unified at any weight division. He's been at 135 now for years and hasn't faced any of the top fighters in the division, many of whom have left the weight class now, right? At 130, it was a similar situation. He fought a lot of guys coming up in weight as opposed to just fighting the other world champions at that weight division. And outside of Lomachenko, it's not as if that division was that good. It wasn't, right? But we know promotional companies, specifically prior to last year and primarily this year, tried to protect their assets to try to profit off of them. No one's hating on that. Nobody is being disparaging towards the PBC or any other promotional company that does that. We understand why they do that. For money. The green, right? So when people are critical of Tank Davis, as long as it's, of course, not Devin Haney fans, because Devin Haney fans are right now the equivalent of Errol Spence fans, right? They're just doing nothing but literally hating on Bud Crawford, or in this case, Tank Davis, just to do what? Fanboy and build up the fighter they support. But yet, you didn't have to shit on Bud Crawford to build up Errol Spence. Errol Spence did what he had to do, right? Does it mean he was better than Crawford? No. But he did a lot of good things before getting beat by Crawford. But it's a bad look when you consistently push out all this negativity and all this hate towards Bud Crawford, and then he goes out and beats the fucking dog shit out of Errol Spence, right? And this happens all the time. We saw this with Wilder fans who were acting as if AJ and Eddie Hearn and Matchroom, who, as I just mentioned, don't mind putting their fighters in tough, don't mind their fighters getting beat because that's consistent, acted as if it was them that was ducking. But Spence was the A side. AJ was the A side. Canelo was the A side. A sides like Tank Davis tend to get things pushed in their favor, right? That's just the way it is. And unfortunately, Wilder and his team did not want to play ball, and they ended up cherry picking Fury, which ended up being a terrible decision for them. Sure, they made money, right? So I mean, at the end of the day, financially, they ended up getting a windfall from it nonetheless. Not as much as potentially they would have got from fighting AJ, but it is what it is, right? Uh, you know, 6 of these and a half dozen of those. Overall, Wilder's career ended up being good, not great. He ended up getting paid tons of cash, so it worked out perfectly for him financially. His fanboys, I mean, the truth is their fighter was never the fighter they made him out to be, but he still went on to have a great career for him and still got paid huge cash. And he's happy about what happened in his career, more or less, right? So, each person has their own career. Each individual has their own path. And we just need a little more honesty in boxing. And unfortunately, we tend not to get too much of that. So let's check out this video just to break it down and take a look at it. So here we go. So this was one video I saw out from JB, who literally was trying to fanboy Tank Davis, who literally he shit on today by showing footage of Devin Haney beating him in sparring and trying to somehow discredit and downplay Tank Davis, literally coming off of what was a very good win today against Frank Martin, who you see on this list. But what this guy was trying to do is act like, oh, because Tank Davis's past 8 opponents have a combined record of 186-4. Somehow that justifies everything that's happened. Somehow this means his resume is fucking great. One of the best resumes in boxing. But that ain't true. We know that the majority of these people didn't have losses in their resume because they hadn't stepped up and taken on legitimate opposition. Cruz already had a loss or a draw. Obviously, the best guy on this list career-wise is Leo Santa Cruz, but he ended up facing him in his 4th weight division. Frank Martin had never beaten a top 10 opponent at lightweight. Ryan Garcia did. He beat Luke Campbell, so at least he beat one top 10 fighter. Rolly Romero literally had never beaten a top 10 lightweight. Gamboa hadn't been relevant since fucking he got knocked out by Bud Crawford 6-7 years earlier. Right? And as far as Mario Barros, I mean, what's he known for? Beating a Ugis and getting beat by Keith Thurman. I mean, 2 good opponents, but think about when you fought them and who they were when you fought them, right? Let's try to guesstimate how he's going to do against Boots Ennis. That's not going to look so good for him, is it? And I'm not trying to hate on Tank Davis, but think about this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these fighters he faced at 135. Obviously, Santa Cruz he faced at 130. Mario Barros, he fought at 140, jumping up from 130 to fight Mario Barros at 140, and then coming down to 135, and then coming down to 130 to fight Leo Santa Cruz, and then going back up to 135. It was quite the convoluted traveling. But out of these fighters, one of whom was pulled up from 130, Garcia, and then, as I just mentioned, the other 5, not one of these guys was a legitimate top 10 fighter except for Ryan Garcia. But yet, of course, when Tank Davis fought Ryan Garcia, it's after he had already moved up to 140, pulled him down, and weight drained him for that fight. So you didn't even fight him when he was actually fighting in your division. You fought him and pulled him down after he grew out of the weight class. So really you had Gamboa, Rolly Romero, Frank Martin, and Cruz. Those were the top fighters he faced at 135 pounds during his time at this weight class. I mean, not one of them, I think, was a 135-pound world champion, right? None of them had faced top competition going into a fight with Tank Davis. So if you're trying to use 186-4 to justify his resume and act like somehow he's done a lot and that this is significant, it's delusional. Right? This is the same guy that said, well, Inoue didn't really move up that much weight because, those small weight classes, the difference between weight is far different than when you go up. Sure, the farther you go up, the bigger the weight discrepancies are because the bigger you are, and the more weight you naturally carry. So this is more about percentage of weight, right? If you're a 105-pound fighter and then you're fighting at 115, which is 10 pounds heavier, for a guy that's 115 pounds, that 10 pounds is huge for him and his body type and the percentage of weight he carries. It's almost a tenth of his body weight. Whereas for a heavyweight, to go from 200 pounds to 210, that shit don't mean nothing. That's a big meal without taking a shit before a fight. Literally. Like, that is nothing. He won't even feel that because it's insignificant, right? And this is the kind of people you have to talk about when you're having these conversations. They try to find ways to discredit a guy like Inoue, but yet they try to fanboy and find ways to credit fighters that they like, American black fighters primarily. And that's the thing with guys like this. They're fucking only focused on black American fighters, not even American fighters, yet have been hotly critical of Americans who don't support black American fighters. Yet these are black Americans that don't support non-black American fighters. Example like Elijah Garcia, an American who got beat today and was thrown under the bus and literally called a bum. He's 21 years old, 7 years younger than Gary Russell. And he's a bum because he took his first loss in his career. And then this guy comes out with a video today saying, people shouldn't be so negative towards a fighter taking a loss. Well, the only person I saw being negative was fucking you, literally coming out with a video using Elijah Garcia to shit on fighters from around the world. Yet Elijah Garcia is an American, right? But this is the kind of fake outrage and stupid narratives you see from certain boxing channels on YouTube. But let's move forward. So let's use Bud Crawford as an example. Bud Crawford was a guy whose resume was heavily criticized by Errol Spence fans who said he hadn't fought anybody, right? And then anytime you list people he did fight, what they say is, oh, well, that wasn't the best version of him. Oh, well, this is that. And oh, so they have an excuse for every single situation, right? He fought Raymond Beltran, who went on after this to become a world champion. Thomas Delorme, who was still fighting up until last year in relevant fights. Derry Jean, obviously nothing special. Hank Lundy, active but very low-level C fighter. Victor Postal was still an active fighter fighting top-level competition for a long time. Literally, this guy praised Gary Russell for knocking him out, right? But people didn't give Bud Crawford much credit for it. John Molina Jr., hard puncher, but not a great fighter. Felix Diaz, an Olympian, but never really went on to do too much. Julius Ndongu, at this time, was an undefeated fighter that was a unified champion. Sure, he went on to not do anything after this loss, literally not really get a significant win again. But going into the fight, it was a significant win. Does this mean he was pound for pound number one based on what I just listed? Of course it doesn't. Nobody in the history of boxing would talk about the fights I just listed and put a fighter that won those fights in as a pound for pound top fighter in boxing. But then years later, he added to his legacy, which is inevitably what boxers do. Then he went on and moved up in weight to his third weight, beat Jeff Horn, an undefeated fighter who just beat Pacquiao. Whether you think it was a legitimate win, he didn't get knocked out. Then he fought Benavidez Jr., then Amir Khan, who was a two-weight world champion, Velasquez, who was an undefeated number one contender, hard-punching fighter, then Kell Brook, a world champion, Sean Porter, a three-time welterweight champion, David Avivizian, who Boots Ennis is going to fight, right? And for Crawford, it was a good opponent. And for Boots Ennis, it's a good opponent. David's a good opponent, a good fighter. And then, of course, the biggest fight of his career, the highlight, was Errol Spence Jr., who he fucking destroyed. Guy has a 100% KO ratio at 147. Pretty impressive. And, if he wasn't a black American, people would be accusing him of using PEDs, right? I'm not. But that's what would happen if the situation was different. Then, of course, now he's going to move up to his fourth weight division and fight Israel Madrimov, a fighter that some people were critical of Crawford fighting because some people have nothing good to say about anyone unless it's the fighter they're blowing or they have naked pictures on their wall of. Like, it's ridiculous the extent people go to downplay, discredit, and hate on certain fighters and their resume. If you look at his resume, it's not nearly as impressive as Tank Davis's as far as the win-loss percentage. But he's fought way more world champions in this period of time. Madrimov, Spence, Porter, Brook, Khan, Horn, Indongu, Postal, Raymond Beltran. That's 9 world champions he's faced at this period of time. If we just look at his last 8 fights, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 world champions in his last 8 fights. Tank Davis didn't fight 5 world champions in his last 8 fucking fights. So of course, his fighters are going to look like they have better resumes overall. But when you look at who they fought, that's the truth. That's when they get exposed as guys that just haven't really done anything. The guy that he really made this video to dismiss and downplay, of course, was Inoue. And I don't know why the names are like this on my thing. I don't know what I did when I made this. I fucking put it backwards, which is totally weird. But it is what it is. Sorry about that. But like, literally, it's the same situation with him. He wants to really shit on Inoue and the level of competition he's faced. Yet he faced Neary, what's his face, the Filipino guy, Stephen Fulton, Paul Butler. Part of that, Nonito Donaire. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. His last 5 fights have been against 5 world champions. Prior to that, he faced 2 guys that weren't world champions, so 7 fights. And then, of course, in his 8th fight, another world champion in Maloney. So 6 world champions in 8 fights. Like, it's hard to discredit somebody and downplay somebody who literally has fought 6 world champions in his last 8 fucking fights. But this is what we're talking about when we're talking about people that try to hype somebody up to fanboy somebody else. In his last 8 fights, sure, Rolly Romero became a world champion. Crazy enough. Cruz by beating him. Garcia was a world champion. And of course, Leo Santa Cruz was a champion. So that's 4 world champions in 8 fights. 4. Right? Maybe Mario Barros is going to go on to become a WBC champion. So he could become the 5th, right, in hindsight. So, and Gamboa historically was a champion as well. Okay, so there you go. So that's potentially 6 champions he might face in 8 fights. Potentially. But yet you also have to look at what guys do after they lose to Tank Davis and what they go on. And that tells you a lot about who they are. Are these guys going to go on to do significant things moving up? I mean, nobody thinks Rolly Romero deserved a world title fight coming off of a knockout loss, right? Just like people don't think that Errol Spence deserves a world title fight coming off of a knockout loss. Like a knockout loss. It's not like you lost a close competitive fight. You got fucking flatlined, right? Cruz didn't really deserve a fight moving up to his first fight in another division for a world title, but he got it. And Mario Barros, he deserves a fight. He's coming off of a Yugas win, right? And so that's significant. Obviously, you know, it'll be interesting to see what he does at 147 now that Boots Ennis is there. But nonetheless, so of course, here's his resume, right? And I'm not trying to downplay or discredit, but it's this fanboy notion that people think because of his resume, he deserves to be somehow in the top 5 pound for pound. That because of his resume, somehow he is the face of boxing. When you look here, you know, you have Cuellar, Gamboa, Santa Cruz, Isaac Cruz now, Rolly Romero, and Garcia. 6 fighters in all the fights listed here that at one time have been world champions, right? Liam Walsh, Fonseca, Hugo Reyes was a regular champion. I think Nunez never was. Mario Barros could potentially be, and Ryan Garcia probably never be, and Frank Martin after today probably never will either. He wanted to highlight these fighters that you had all these fighters with O's, but Mario Barros was a regular WBA champion who hadn't fought any legitimate high-level fighters up until that fight. Rolly Romero, 14 wins, was a fucking bum, and everybody knew he was a bum. Hector Garcia had a big win, became a champion, being part of the PBC, getting a WBA champion, but just lost 2 fights in a row. Ryan Garcia was potentially a world title champion and contender. Best win, of course, a good fight against Campbell. But now steroids, fucking a loss to Tank Davis, right? A lot of this leaves everything up in the air about his future. Frank Martin is undefeated at 18-0, but the truth of the situation is, who had he fought? Kind of like Francisco Fonseca. He was undefeated here. Who had he fought? Liam Walsh was a UK fighter, 21-0, but who the fuck had he fought? Right? That's the difference between these guys and Cuellar, who was a legitimate champion, fought legitimate fighters like Abner Moritz. Hugo Ruiz fought good opponents, but never elite fighters, I don't think. Had 4 losses. Nunez, solid fighter, multiple losses. Gamboa was elite, but all these 2 losses came early on, right? And since then, he's literally done nothing. Should have lost to Sosa, was gifted a decision there, right? You can look more in depth at a person's resume, see what kind of wins they're coming off of, inactivity they're facing, the level of competition they're facing before they step in to take on these big fighters. And that really tells you a lot. It really tells you the truth. That is the minutia of a resume. That's why when you make a fight prediction, you don't just look at a guy's resume and go, Liam Walsh, 21-0. Fuck yeah, he's going to win for sure. You can't do that. You have to say, Liam Walsh, okay, who's he fought? And when you look, you find out he's a domestic UK fighter. 21-0, but fighting domestic UK fighters. So now you think about him against a world-class fighter, and you could assume that he's probably going to get his ass beat, which is exactly what happened, right? And as I say, I'm not trying to hate on Tank Davis' resume. There's a lot of good things about his resume. But the person hyping up Tank Davis's resume has went out of his way to shit all over Inoue's resume multiple times. Yet Inoue's fought more champions than Tank Davis has. We saw all the Errol Spence fanboys who, consistently shit on and hate on Bud Crawford's resume hard, right? We just saw Errol Spence go out of his way to literally shit on Tank Davis's resume, saying that Michel Rivera could beat everyone on his resume. I don't think that's fucking true at all, but that's people's perspective. When they're trying to hype up their fighter, like Errol Spence is trying to hype up Frank Martin, he's going to say things to disparage Tank Davis's resume and the level of competition he faced to try to make it sound like the level of competition his fighter took on was better. It's not, and everybody knows it's not, right? And we can look at all 3 of these guys, and in truth, you're arguing about 3 fighters that are pound for pound top 10, Inoue, Crawford, and Tank Davis. Tank Davis hasn't done anything career-defining, even close to Inoue or a Bud Crawford. But at the same time, he's the youngest out of all of them. And he's an exciting fighter, like they are. So people are very optimistic about what he's going to do moving forward in his career, right? The news now is that he's going to be fighting Lomachenko in October, November. That would be a fucking huge career-defining fight for him. And significantly, probably the biggest and best fight of his career. I mean, it might not do as much pay-per-views as Ryan Garcia, but anybody that's a real boxing fan knows it's a far more significant fight than fucking Ryan Garcia, right? Anybody knows that. So here we go. We got these 3 fighters, one who's ranked number 8 on Ring Magazine's pound for pound, one who's number 2, one who's number 3. Some people will get into emotions based on the fact that Inoue's ranked above Crawford. Usyk is ranked above both of them. The truth is, this just shows what I've been talking about historically, that boxing is deep and global, and because of that, there's a lot of representation. That's not a bad thing. That's a great thing for the sport of boxing. And here you have 2 great Americans in Tank Davis and Bud Crawford who represent the sport well, who are 2 dynamic, exciting fighters. But I don't need to shit on them to hype up fucking Inoue. But unfortunately, some people feel the need that that's what they have to do. They have to literally go out of their way to disparage, downplay everything Inoue's done, to hype up Crawford to be ranked above him, to hype up Devin Haney, which is a ridiculous fucking conversation. Like, there's no way Devin Haney should even be in the conversation. And then, of course, Tank Davis. Right now, of course, people have been going back and forth Errol Spence fans, Bud Crawford fans, the whole Tank Davis, Devin Haney thing, right? We know the LDBC jumped off, of course, the Errol Spence bandwagon and jumped straight onto the Devin Haney bandwagon. And then a significant amount of PBC fans stayed geared towards Tank Davis. So you still have this back and forth going on, right? Which isn't about race. It's not about nationality. It's not about any of these political points that some people love to fucking badger and beat to death. These are all Black American fighters. And the fight is amongst other Black American boxing fans who can't give the other fighter any credit. And this is, of course, what we see from many fans towards many non-Black American fighters. Lomachenko, Inoue, Roman Gonzalez, Usyk. I mean, the list, of course, goes on. Golovkin, Kovalev, Beterbiev, Bivol, whoever, right? The reality is whenever a non-Black American fighter is doing something significant, a lot of American fans go out of their way to try to downplay and discredit them, which is unjustified. You don't need to do that, right? You don't need to hate on somebody to build up somebody else. You can give someone shine and then still give the fighter you like his flowers. It doesn't have to be us or them. But unfortunately, with many of these channels, it's more about creating this back and forth and this racial diatribe. So a lot of people have been talking about how Tank Davis is the face of boxing in America. He's the biggest seller. He is an icon and this and that. Right here from this magazine, the highest paid professional boxers in the world as of May 22nd, 2024. So this is based on the last reported income tax information, I guess, that they have access to. And they're listing, of course, the top 100 fighter athletes, right? I don't even know who specifically. We saw this from Forbes magazine, who came out and also talked about promotional companies as well. Obviously, by looking here, Canelo is high, but is Canelo number one? We will find out. Even though he's the face on this magazine, he may not be the face that's the number one profitable boxer in the world. But as far as American boxing goes, undoubtedly, it's probably him who's number one. But yet people want to continue to compare Tank Davis to Canelo and act like somehow Canelo is falling behind and somehow Tank Davis is overcoming, taking over. But let's look at these numbers. So here we go. So these are the top 7 highest paid combat sports people. Anthony Joshua, 250. Canelo, 200. Fury, 150. Usyk, 83.8. Paul, 80. Garcia, 40.5. Tank Davis, 36. What does that tell you right there? You have a social media face in Jake Paul and Ryan Garcia, for that matter, who are both, right up there. Jake Paul, obviously, ahead of both Ryan Garcia and Tank Davis, who just did 1.2 million pay-per-view buys in their fight, which was obviously a huge, very great result for their fight. But Jake Paul is consistently putting out big numbers, putting out tons of fights. He's doing the work, putting the work in to get paid. Obviously, Usyk, Fury, and AJ are heavyweights, and we know the heavyweights are getting paid. They're getting paid from Saudi Arabia. They're just getting paid. So there's no surprise that those 3 fighters are there. It's a little surprising that Wilder's not there, but that's probably because Wilder's been a little inactive up until this year, when he also jumped on the Saudi Arabian train and took 2 losses. And then, of course, you have Canelo, who's right there at number 2, 200 million. Out of all of these guys in the top 5, obviously he's Mexican, but represents the face of American boxing. There's talk about potentially Jake Paul and Canelo. Based on these numbers, that fight makes tons of sense. If Canelo chooses to drop his fucking undisputed titles and then fight Jake Paul on pay-per-view, that fight probably will do fucking 5 million pay-per-view buys and put up unbelievable numbers. Because look, Jake Paul is a huge fucking star as far as social media and boxing. right? So this just puts things into perspective when these people try to talk about Tank Davis being the face of boxing. Tank Davis is not even above Ryan Garcia, yet he was the A side. And people may poo-poo and question these. I mean, you can do what you want, do your own research, and then leave a rebuttal. I'm just following the information that I found online, and that's what it is. So Tank Davis, one of the best and most exciting boxers today, but why is he being protected by racial fanboys who are quick to shit on others, right? And that's the problem with this. It's not Tank Davis himself. Like a lot of people talk about how they're holding Canelo accountable. Canelo is responsible to represent and do this because he is that. Yet these same people don't hold Tank Davis to the same level of criticism. If you want to talk about him being the face of American boxing, being a pay-per-view star, the way Canelo is, then you should be holding him just as accountable as Canelo Alvarez. That's all I've ever said, right? I'm not out here shitting on Tank Davis. When he fought Frank Martin, I told you the way it was. Frank Martin is a good opponent, but he's not a name. So it's not as if it's going to be a big, successful pay-per-view. Expect Tank Davis to knock him out, which is what he did. I didn't make this video before that. I made it after because I didn't want to seem like I was hating on Tank Davis before his big event, right? So then we released this after he got his, big victory and is getting his flowers for doing exactly what he needed to do in a stellar performance. Fantastic performance by Tank Davis. But the question isn't about Tank Davis. The question is about these ridiculous trolls and fanboys on YouTube and on X and throughout social media. They consistently want to say things that aren't based on truth, are just based on fallacy and fanboy narratives. The truth is, Tank Davis is one of the most exciting fighters in boxing. It was a great fight today. Great outcome. Look at all the people that were there. It was a big event. I was watching the fight in Puerto Rico as well. I mean, of course, Tito Trinidad was there, but it wasn't even a comparable fight to, of course, this. And this is a fighter that represents Puerto Rico. You figure the feeling, the atmosphere would be huge, significant, because here is a fighter from a small island representing this great history of boxing. Whereas Tank Davis is in Vegas. It's Vegas, right? He's not from Vegas. None of the people at the fight are from Vegas. Everybody's an import from somewhere else in the U.S. But the vibe was electric. It was a great show, a great outcome, a great fight. Overall, the card was good for an $80 pay-per-view. Of course, Subriel Matiz in Puerto Rico was free on DAZN, so there was no $80 pay-per-view. But it also wasn't nearly as good of a card. So thank fuck for that, because nobody would have paid for that. But overall, it was a great weekend of boxing. I mean, we got some really, really interesting results. Matias lost at home, making his title defense, which is something that happens, man. People go home to make title defenses and often ended up losing, right? Hurd was an example of that. And there's been obviously many others. Gary Russell ended up losing today. I have people going at me on X saying that, Russell should have won. Puello wasn't landing enough effective punches. I'm like, whatever. You see what you want to see. Like, literally. I have nothing against Gary Russell. Actually, I predicted he would win by a 10th round TKO. I was favoring him to win the fight. But when you watch the fight and you don't really care who wins, you just want to see a good, significant fight, you see things a little differently than if you go in wanting, praying, hoping that a particular fighter is going to win. But let me know in the comment section below, do you think Russell won? I mean, it's a close fight. If Russell would have got the decision, I wouldn't have been upset, except for that 118, 110 card, which was downright fucking ridiculous. But that's what happens when you have 3 American fucking judges. Leave your comments below. Thanks for watching. Peace out, everyone. Let me know in the comment section below, is Tank Davis' resume great, or are there fights he should have had by now that we were hoping for? Because that's all people are saying.